Good morning, and thank you for joining us in this Sunday morning seminary series. It's a beautiful February morning, and I don't know if you're joining me from a snow-covered Sunday, but it's beautiful, and we're thankful for that. This Sunday morning, we'd like to welcome for our session. Today's session is Food Justice and Food Apartheid in Memphis. And it is taught to us today by Dr. Emily Holmes. She's an associate professor in religion and philosophy at Christian Brothers here in Memphis. And she's also an adjunct professor in land, food, and faith formation here at Memphis Theological Seminary. This special series is funded by a grant from the United Methodist Earth Keepers and sponsored by the Green Seminary Initiative at Memphis Theological Seminary, which I am proud to be a part of. So I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Emily and welcome you, and the floor is yours. We will have a Q&A later. So if you do have a question as she's speaking, please post it in the Q&A, and when we do break, we will ask her those questions. Thank you, Dr. Emily.
Great, good morning. Thank you, Vicki, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you here this morning. I'd like to thank Vicki and Martha Lyle and the entire Green Seminary Initiative at MTS for organizing this series, and the United Methodist Earth Keepers for sponsoring it. And thanks, Nathan, for the tech support. I'd also like to thank our previous speakers, Dr. Valerie Bridgman and Dr. Laurel Kearns, who gave such fantastic talks over the past 2 weeks. This morning, I'm going to build on what they laid out for us and focus more narrowly on the topic of food within this larger context of creation care and environmental justice. And I do welcome your questions. So as you think of them, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, or you can make comments in the chat, and we will circle back to them at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and let's see if we can get this to work. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Vicki, can you give me a thumbs up that looks good? Okay, great. All right. So I want to start out with just a few theological points to give us some context for everything that follows. And as you're probably aware, our culture and our economic system tends to encourage us to view food as a commodity. That is something that is produced, exchanged, bought, and sold according to the logic of the marketplace. But in a Christian theological perspective, food is not primarily a commodity, it's a relationship. And it's a relationship that runs in at least 3 different directions: relationship with God, relationship with the natural world, and relationship with one another. So first, food is relationship with God. In a Christian theological perspective, food is a gift of God. It's for which we give thanks. And as a gift of God that we take and we put it into our bodies, it's one of the most intimate ways that we come to know God's love. As theologian Norman Worspa puts it, food is God's love made edible, and not just edible, but delectable. It's God's love made delicious. But food is also a relationship with nature. The fact that we need to eat reveals our deep embodiment, our interconnections with, our dependence upon the natural world. No matter what we eat, even highly processed foods, even a Twinkie, our food comes from somewhere. The soil or the water, which makes us part of this larger ecological food chain. We put plants and animals and yeasts and mushrooms and minerals into our bodies, and they become part of us. As what William Ralph Inga wrote, the whole of nature is a conjugation of the verb to eat in the active and the passive. And that includes us as eaters and ultimately as eaten. We will be decomposed by microbes and fungi. And just as Ash Wednesday this past week reminds us of our eventual mortality, each meal can remind us of our connection to plants and animals, sunlight, soil, and water through our place in the food chain. But food is also a relationship with other human beings. We humans have elaborate cultural rules and traditions about how to obtain and prepare and share food with one another. Eating together reinforces our human ties. It creates community. It's one of the things I miss the most during the pandemic. Michael Pollan brings these last 2 points about nature and culture together when he writes that the way we eat represents our most profound engagement with the natural world. Daily, our eating turns nature into culture, transforming the body of the world into our bodies and minds. Now, my primary theological interest and background is in the incarnation and the idea that God became embodied in Jesus. And so I'm particularly interested in how food connects us to what Sally McFague calls the body of God in creation and to the body of Christ in the Eucharist or communion, as well as to the bodies of other people, including the hungry in whom we meet Christ, and according to the Son of Man parable. And so I've included here this image of Christ as the man of sorrows. It's a great medieval image. His wounds are growing wheat and grapes. You can see growing out of the wounds in his feet and hands. And these are the wheat and the grapes through which, through human cultivation, baking, fermentation, they become the wine. They become the host, and then in a liturgical context, they again become the body and blood of Christ. The Eucharist or communion, Lord's Supper, however you refer to it, it's a shared meal on some level, right? But like all good rituals, it's an intensification. It's a reduction in the culinary sense of all of our ordinary meals. So what I love about this painting is that it suggests that the wheat and the grapevine, they're already the body of Christ, right? Even before they're made into bread or wine and consecrated. So if we could come to see all our meals like that as the body of Christ, how might that transform the way we think of our food? In Wendell Berry's essay on the pleasures of eating, he concludes this brief essay by citing the poet William Carlos Williams, who writes, "There's nothing to eat, seek it where you will, but the body of the Lord. The blessed plants and the sea yield it to the imagination intact." And he doesn't say much more about it. He just says this seems to him to be accurate, but it definitely is suggestive for the imagination. And I've included here an image, a Russian icon of the Theotokos of Mary as she who ripens the wheat. And the implication here, at least as I interpret this icon, is that the wheat is Christ. So there's a lot here to unpack. We could spend the whole hour just talking about these 2 paintings, I think, but I really just want to use this as a way to make some theological points to set up what follows. And the points I want to make are, first, food is relationship with God, with the natural world, and with the human community. Second, eating is this incredibly intimate way that we experience all of these relationships. And third, that communion can be a lens through which we come to perceive God's body in all our food. And therefore, we can learn to treat food with appropriate reverence, gratitude, and humility, as Dr. Bridgman reminded us our first week. So that's where I want to start. Now let's get into the ethics of eating. Okay, so what is food justice? Food is a relationship, but that relationship can be healthy or it can be toxic, right? When relationships are distorted or damaging or they've caused harm, we call for justice. Justice refers to right relationships among people, but also, as Dr. Kearns pointed out last week, right relations with all of creation. In our modern food system, so many of our relationships are broken and they are in need of reconciliation and restoration. So calls for justice in our food system first emerged in activist circles among growers and organizers in communities of color. The concept of food justice was partly a reaction to what is sometimes called the alternative food movement, which dates back to the 1960s, back to the land counterculture. And it tends to focus on organic foods, sustainable farming, farmers markets, locally sourced ingredients in high-end restaurants. And these are all good things. But the spokespeople like Chef Alice Waters or Michael Pollan, they tend to be overwhelmingly white and come from relatively privileged contexts. And so Black and brown activists in cities in California, New York, Milwaukee, Detroit, people like Malik Yakini here, they were also talking about local food and sustainable farming and cooperative markets and access to healthy, locally grown foods, but they were getting a lot less national attention. So they used the term food justice to describe their approach. One early attempt to define what food justice is comes from this book by Robert Gottlieb and Anupana Joshi. So they say that food justice is ensuring that the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown and produced, transported and distributed, and accessed and eaten are shared fairly. So production, distribution, and consumption of food, benefits and risks are shared fairly. What makes the food justice movement different from other advocates of alternative or local food is first this explicit call for social justice, that food is a human right, that the benefits and risks should be fairly distributed. And second, they take an intersectional approach to examine the way our food system intersects with the history of racism in the US, with our healthcare system, with transportation, housing, labor, land access, distribution, all the areas that impact how our food is produced and distributed and consumed. Okay, one way that I've tried to picture this complex domain of food justice is with a Venn diagram. I love a Venn diagram. And here I'm inspired in part by Garrett Broad's book, More Than Just Food. So we can think of food justice as being at the intersection here of these three different realms, each of which intersects with our food system, but each of which also extends beyond just food. So these are the environment, including non-human animals, labor, including farmer livelihood and food chain workers' rights, grocery store workers, and health, including food security and food access. So we're going to go through these one at a time to explore some of these issues. Okay, so under the heading of environment and non-human animals, as Dr. Kern said last week, the environment is where we live, work, play, learn, and pray. And of course, it's also where we eat, and it's where and how we obtain our food. Most of our food is produced in a highly efficient, highly industrialized food system that produces cheap food for the consumer, benefits a few major multinational corporations, and externalizes all the risks and costs onto our environment, including our soil, air, and water. And so just briefly, a few of these issues. Industrial livestock production, or CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, they treat animals as commodities rather than as fellow creatures of God. So they're squeezed into tiny spaces, they're deprived of access to sunlight and pasture, and they're slaughtered in ways that maximize the efficiency. And it is supposed to be humane, but many people are concerned about the treatment of animals, and the workers aren't treated much better than the animals in these operations. Industrial livestock production also affects our air and water quality. But the way most vegetables and grains are grown isn't a whole lot better. Conventional farming methods have led to erosion, topsoil depletion, you see here. Application of fertilizers leads to nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, which causes blue baby alerts for groundwater in rural areas, and the hypoxic zone here in the Gulf of Mexico. The application of some pesticides harms pollinators. It contributes to bee colony collapse. And the preference for monoculture in farming leads to loss of species diversity. And the vast distances over which we transport food, or our food miles, along with our dependence on petroleum for energy and fertilizer, contributes to climate change. So simply put, the way we produce most of our food is not sustainable. And to go back to our definition of food justice, the environmental impact and the risks of these production methods disproportionately fall on economically disadvantaged communities. Okay, so under the heading of labor. So here we can include all the issues related to the ability of farmers to access and keep their land, as well as farm worker and food chain working conditions. Farmers are in crisis in the US and around the world. They are among the victims of our demand for cheap food. It's difficult to make a living farming, and many farmers are at risk of losing their land. And to take just the example of Black farmers here, in 1920, 14% of all US farmers were Black, nearly a million. And they owned collectively over 16 million acres. By 1997, there were fewer than 20,000 Black farmers, and they owned only about 2 million acres collectively. So why this dramatic loss of Black-owned land? Well, it's complicated, but unequal application of the New Deal Agricultural Adjustment Act in the 1930s, lack of access to credit and legal services, and outright discrimination by the USDA, which was acknowledged in the Pigford v. Glickman case in 1999, in which Black farmers successfully sued the USDA for discrimination. And this is, even though the settlement is still ongoing, this is the closest we've come to actual reparations in this country. Also, under the heading of labor, farm workers have disproportionately borne the risks of our food system. From our history of slavery and sharecropping to underpaid workers in the Central Valley of California or the tomato fields of Florida. Last week in the discussion, someone mentioned the problem of pesticide exposure in the Mississippi Delta resulting in cancer. This was also a major issue for the grape pickers who were organized here by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And here you have fruit pickers. I think there's the citrus trees in California working in smoke-filled air during the fires last fall. Food justice is also concerned with food workers across the industry, such as those working in meat packing plants in South Dakota, where some of the first COVID outbreaks happened. You might also remember the ICE raids that happened at chicken processing plants in Mississippi in August 2019. And this image was in the news. This little girl's parents were arrested in the ICE raid, and they were unable to pick her up on her first day of school. There are approximately 11 million undocumented people in the US, and they comprise between 30 and 50% of farm workers and food chain workers. So food production is hard, it's sometimes dangerous work, and some US companies prefer to recruit and hire workers who are vulnerable to deportation and therefore less likely to complain or organize around their working conditions. So it goes on and on. One good thing about the pandemic, I think, is that it has laid bare all these issues and the role of essential workers in our food system. And maybe people are starting to appreciate a little bit more the people who provide their food. But again, it's poor people working minimum wage jobs who disproportionately bear all the risks of our food production, risks like injury and COVID exposure and deportation. So this is not what God wants, right? This is clearly not the kingdom of God. Okay, so lastly, under the heading of health, we can include food quality, food access, and food security. For most people, I think it's concerns about their health that lead to questions about our food system and then interest in food justice. After all, most people no longer come from a farming background, and labor until recently has been pretty invisible. But everyone eats and everyone wants to be healthy. When you start to consider the health effects of our food system, what immediately stands out is how much of the American diet consists of highly processed foods that we know contributes to diet-related diseases, such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, some cancers, high blood pressure, heart disease, and so on. So why do Americans eat so much processed food? Food that ultimately makes us sick? Well, it's cheap, it's available, and it's palatable. It's cheap because the production of corn and soy is subsidized by US farm policy. which is why a bottle of grape soda is cheaper than a bunch of grapes. It's available because processed foods are shelf stable, right? They don't go bad like fresh foods. And it's palatable because it is designed to push our evolutionary driven craving for fatty and salty and sweet foods. Um, our culture tends to think that this is simply a matter of individual choice and market demand, and to encourage individuals to make better food choices and then blame or shame people for failing to make the right choice. And like this image of the two hands, either it's the processed food or it's the healthy food, as if it's so simple. And that kind of graphic, as I was putting together the slideshow, that is all over the internet, that it's just, you just choose one or the other. And we also hear confusing and contradictory advice from experts about what to eat. We have a tendency to divide the world into good foods and bad foods, and this creates a lot of shame and anxiety around eating. But here's the thing, our food system shapes the choices that are available to us through market forces, through federal policies, through agricultural subsidies, through trade agreements. We have a lot less freedom than we think. And while that's true for all of us, people who are economically disadvantaged are especially constrained. In other words, everyone's choices are limited, but if you are poor, you have even fewer options. So instead of blaming the individual for their choices, we need to look at the entire food system, and we need to ask, what are the barriers? If we believe that food is gift, it's relationship, maybe even the body of Christ, then barriers to healthy food access, it's a desecration of that body. It's a rejection of that gift. It's separation rather than relationship. In other words, what Christians call sin. Okay, so in these three domains, environment, labor, and health, we see the way our food system intersects with other problems in the US. So now you've got a big picture overview of what food justice is about. And in our remaining time, I want to focus in on this narrower question of food security here in Memphis. Okay, so the USDA tracks food insecurity as part of its anti-hunger programs and defines it as a lack of consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life. Food insecurity is somewhat different from hunger. Think of food insecurity as not always knowing where your next meal is coming from. And it's measured at the household level. It's an economic and social condition. Whereas hunger is an individual level physiological condition that may result from food insecurity. We rarely have outright starvation in the United States, as you might see in some developing countries. But we do have a lot of hunger and malnutrition that result from food insecurity. We also have a lot of obesity, and we have to learn how to see obesity, both obesity and malnutrition, as symptoms of the same problem. And that problem is not having consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life. So the problem is food insecurity that results in the symptoms of malnutrition and obesity. So let's take a look at a few numbers here at food insecurity in the US and Shelby County. So in 2019, 10.5% of US households were food insecure, 35 million people, and that's actually the lowest it had been for a while. Of course, that was before the pandemic. So now, as of October 2020, Feeding America now estimates that there are more than 50 million people experiencing food insecurity, including a potential 17 million children due to the pandemic. Here in Shelby County, according to Feeding America, Shelby County has the highest rate of food insecurity in Tennessee. In 2018, it was about 15% of our population, which again, the numbers were improving in 2018, 2019. but the projected 2020 overall food insecurity rate, we're back up to 19.3% for Shelby County. You're probably already familiar with the work of the Mid-South Food Bank if you're in this class. You probably know that they serve 455,000 food insecure people across 31 counties. And I'm sure you've seen on the news the long lines at the mobile pantry food distributions. You may partner with the food bank through local food pantries. 1 in 3 children in Shelby County are food insecure. In Memphis, that number is higher. I could not find the exact number of food insecurity for the city. If anyone knows that, if you could drop that in the chat, I'd appreciate it. The number that was in my head is 39%. Or 40%, but that may be the child poverty rate, and I might be misremembering that. So I know that it is higher in Memphis versus the county. Okay, so one of the major barriers to food security is access to healthy food in the neighborhood in which people live. And you may have heard of food deserts. They've gotten a lot of attention over the past decade, especially when Michelle Obama made eliminating them part of her Let's Move campaign. So what is a food desert? Again, this is something that is tracked by the USDA Economic Research Service. USDA defines an urban food desert as a low income, if you're looking up here at the graph, LI is low income and LA is low access. So a low income community where at least 1/3 of the population lives more than a mile from a grocery store and they do not own an automobile. So it's this combination of low income, which is based on census numbers, and low access to a full service grocery store, more than 1 mile in an urban area and more than 10 miles in a rural area. That's what makes a food desert. So this is the map of Shelby County, and you can go to the USDA website and find an interactive version if you're here from another city or community. The green area is more than 1 mile from a full service grocery store. The orange area is 1/2 mile from a full service grocery store, which, you know, it doesn't sound very far, 1/2 mile or a mile, right? Unless you don't have transportation, or if you're elderly or you have mobility issues. So you can see, where are the food deserts in Shelby County? Well, they're in North Memphis, South Memphis, Binghamton, over here. This is the Poplar Corridor, by the way. Parts of Whitehaven, Hickory Hill, Berclair, Fraser. But this term, these areas, they also have low income people, Cordova, but people tend to have cars in these areas, so they're not considered food deserts. But this term food desert, it's been criticized from a couple different directions. One, it has this connotation of an empty wasteland in which, when in fact, these are vibrant communities. They're full of people with rich history, culture, and potential. Two, there is some food in the communities, only it might be found in gas stations or convenience stores or fast food restaurants. But three, the reason it's been criticized most importantly is that it's an outsider term. People living in these communities don't call their neighborhoods deserts, right? And this question of naming is a justice issue. So this is Karen Washington, and she lives in the Bronx, and she prefers the term food apartheid rather than food deserts. So she says, what I would rather say instead of food desert is food apartheid, because food apartheid looks at the whole food system along with race, geography, faith, and economics. You say food apartheid and you get to the root cause of some of the problems around the food system. It brings in hunger and poverty. It brings us to the more important question, what are some of the social inequalities that you see, and what are you doing to erase some of the injustices? So using this term food apartheid, it might make some people uncomfortable. It might make white people feel a little defensive, because it suggests that food deserts aren't just accidentally created by the free market. right? It implies that they're the deliberate result of policy decisions that keep our resources in some areas and deprive people in other areas of basic resources like food. And that's exactly what I think she's saying and what I'm saying as well. Clearly, there is no South Africa style apartheid in the sense of legal restrictions on where you can shop, right? Or where you can live. But we do still live with the legacy of segregation in Memphis. And depending on where you live, you might have to travel a lot farther to get to the grocery store to meet your food needs. So let's look at this map of where the grocery stores are located. And this is where I wish we were in person or I could see your faces, because I'd love to, get feedback on what do you notice here? Where are the grocery stores located? There's lots in Midtown here. The red apples are the full scale grocer. The yellow are the small or discount grocer. And the green is the same food desert map from the USDA that we just looked at. So there's lots in Midtown. There's a whole bunch along the Poplar Corridor and in East Memphis. Why so many? Well, you might be thinking that's where a lot of white people live, right? And they have lots of food choices. Whole Foods, right over here. There's 2 different Krogers, a Sprouts, Super Low, Target's there, and they're all in spitting distance of each other. Grocery store location, yes, it's based on market dynamics. It's based on where people have money to spend. It's also located near the competition, right? But it's also the matter of having the capital to open a store, which means that banking and investment is part of the story as well. And this whole financial side of the food system is something I'm just starting to wrap my head around. And by the way, this video from The Guardian, if you haven't seen it yet, I strongly encourage you to watch it. You can just Google that title. It's a 13-minute video about Memphis, and it shows the degree to which we still live in a divided city, divided by race, and how geography determines food access. Okay, so let's unpeel one more layer here. And so I can show you this other map. And I know this can be a little bit hard to see. This is a redlining map of Memphis from the 1930s. And just to get you oriented, here's Overton Park. Here's the fairgrounds, what's now Liberty Bowl, Tiger Lane. So here's East Parkway, here's South Parkway. Let's see, Poplar is running down this way through here, through the map. This is Lamar. This is a train track here that goes up through the Beltline neighborhood. So this map was commissioned by a federal agency, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which was working with the Homeowners Loan Corporation and local realtors in Memphis to designate certain neighborhoods as safe or risky for investing. This map and others like it were used by banks until the late 1960s to make decisions on whether to approve mortgage, business, and construction loans. This practice was outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But let's just look at it for a little bit. Okay, so the green areas, the green lined neighborhoods. All right, here's Central Gardens right here. Here's this area, I don't know what this neighborhood's called, just south of Overton Park, along the parkways. This is Chickasaw Gardens, East Memphis. So the green areas were considered the most safe investments. The blue were still desirable. Okay, you've got Midtown, Evergreen, Idlewild, more in East Memphis. These are the areas that the green areas were exclusively white. The blue areas were definitely majority white, while the redlined areas were majority black. Downtown, Beale Street area, South Memphis, North Memphis, Orange Mound, and Binghamton, right? So again, I'd love to get your reaction to this map. It was unearthed by researchers in the National Archives only 4 years ago, and so now it's made public through this digital scholarship project. And what it does is provide evidence, proof of the deliberate nature of disinvestment in majority Black neighborhoods in Memphis because they were considered hazardous or declining and dangerous to give loans for either businesses or for mortgages in those neighborhoods. And today, if you're familiar with Memphis, you know that these are still the neighborhoods that suffer from high poverty rates, blighted properties, absence of grocery stores. And the point here is that these were deliberate policy decisions made by local lenders, insurers, and realtors with the support of the federal government up until 1968. So given that history, I think it's appropriate to speak of food apartheid with reference to the Memphis food desert map. Our current urban landscape was created by this history of segregation and redlining, followed by white flight to the suburbs, especially after the civil rights movement and integration of schools, which means that today access to healthy foods is now determined by where you live, and where you live is still largely determined by race. Okay, so let's try to end here on a more positive note. What would food security look like? What are we trying to achieve, and what does God ask of us to do to feed the hungry and ensure that there is sufficient food for all people? So here's the USDA and UN definitions of food security. Having access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life, and a condition in which all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. You can see the UN definition is a little more extensive. Having access to food, that is eliminating food deserts, eliminating food apartheid, that is necessary. But even having access isn't sufficient to achieve food justice. So I want to take this a step further by looking at what are called the 5 A's of food security. These are identified by Ryerson University as a way to break down what do we really mean when we're talking about food security, and what conditions do we have to meet to achieve food security. And I think this can help us also fill out our theological vision of food as relationship and as gift of God. So first of all, the first A is availability, having sufficient food for all people at all times. Is there enough food for everyone? Is the food available? The answer to these questions is yes. We produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, which is more than there are in the world. Up to 40% of all our food is wasted. It's wasted at every level, you know, in people's homes, but in fields and transportation, in grocery stores. So there is enough food for everyone to eat. The problem is in the distribution. So availability. Second A, accessibility, physical and economic access to food. This is where what we've just been talking about. Can you access food where you live? Do you have transportation? When you reach the food, can you afford it? So not just physical access, but economic access. And this is why eliminating food deserts isn't enough to actually achieve food security, because even if people have physical access, they may not be able to afford healthy food to meet their food needs. So, so this condition, and this is where a lot of our work, I think, in Memphis is happening, is on improving access. Taking it a step further, adequacy, food that is nutritious and safe and supports a healthy lifestyle and is produced in environmentally sustainable ways. So here we bring in the environment, right? So food safety, that's key. But also nutrition, the quality of the food. Is it enough to meet your energy needs and keep you healthy? Is the food produced in ways that are free from harm to soil, water, and animals? I don't know that we can answer these questions in the positive, right? The way most of our food production happens. But let's take it another step. Acceptability, food that is culturally acceptable, appropriate, and ethical, produced and obtained in ways that do not compromise people's dignity, self-respect, or human rights. So this brings culture and ethics into the equation. So is the food that's available culturally appropriate, recognizable, and desirable to eat? Are you free from coercion to meet your food needs? Were the workers paid a living wage? Is it just food? So here we're firmly in the realm of food justice, because we're not just talking about access or production, but we're also talking about labor. And yeah, so here we're in food justice. But there's one more: agency. The policies and processes that enable the achievement of food security. Do you have influence or control? This is what we mean by agency, having some control or influence over the sources of your food. Do you have a voice in your food system, directly or indirectly, individually or collectively? Do you feel empowered to make change in your community? And this is what we call food sovereignty. And it was a term that was first used in the global South and indigenous communities to advocate for the right to produce their own food according to their own traditional cultural practices. It's been taken up by indigenous communities in North America to describe their efforts. It's similar to food justice, but I think this term sovereignty highlights the question of power. So agency here, it's sometimes called action or activism. I like agency and I like food sovereignty because it asks the question of who has power of decision making when it comes to food production or distribution. If we're going to have justice, we have to share the benefits and risks fairly, equitably. Then the people most affected by the risks should have the most say in what their food system looks like. And that's sovereignty, having control over your own food system. Okay, so I'll just close with some questions for discussion, for consideration, for your own reflection, thinking about how we move from a food charity model to food justice and food sovereignty. So just think about, what did the 5 A's of food security look like in your community? Which have been met, and where do we fall short? What's your vision for the Memphis food system or the Mid-South food system? What are the barriers to food security? How might we overcome them? As Karen Washington asks, what are some of the social inequalities that you see, and what are you doing to erase some of the injustices? I think that's a powerful and convicting question. How might a food justice perspective enhance the way we meet emergency food needs in Memphis? And I think this is important to ask because as Christians, we are called to feed the hungry. And I think we actually do a pretty good job of it in Memphis in meeting emergency food needs. Unfortunately, the need for emergency food has become permanent, and now that soup kitchens and food pantries are supplying people's regular food, which they were never originally meant to be, like a regular food supply. This is where we are, though, in the pandemic. So how could a food justice perspective help us do this work, to do it in more equitable ways, this work to which we are called by God? Okay, last slide. This work of art was created in response to a local story in the Memphis Flyer about food deserts in Memphis. And the artist, Mia Sane, writes, "Fresh food should be accessible to everyone. Southern Vegetation," which is the name of her work, is a reminder that sometimes you have to proactively create a solution when there is no help. Memphis has a long way to go to tackle the food deserts in the city. However, there is hope because the people in these areas haven't given up on themselves. I love this image because it highlights how communities of color are doing this work and are leading the work of advocating for food justice. And like this image, we need to think about long-term solutions that involve greater community control over the production and distribution of food, not just its consumption. In other words, if Memphis stays at the level of increasing emergency food aid, which we do a pretty good job of, but we do nothing to address the problem of low wages or the affordability of healthy food, then we haven't reached justice. If we stay at the level of market-based solutions, we're never going to actually reach food security as a community. If we keep blaming individuals for unhealthy choices and don't ask questions about the entire food system that produces and advertises and incentivizes consumption of cheap calories, then we're not doing justice, right? So we have to draw on the prophetic tradition of the Bible to condemn the exploitation of the poor, to demand that the hungry be fed, and to do justice so that the people most impacted by the problems in our food system are the ones with the power and the agency to reform it. And then food will once again be a means of relationship with God, with nature, with one another, rather than a form of separation or division. And with that, let's turn to questions. I will stop sharing my screen.
All right. We have a really good question submitted by Sylvia Jones. She says nearly 60 years ago, she recalls that her dad looked at bread on a grocery store shelf and was lamenting that it was apparently much cheaper to process most of the nutrients out of flour and then put them back in enriched white bread than to leave the nutrients in, like whole grain bread, according to the prices on the loaves. What pressures can we bring to bear change to both the process and the prices of our food system, which has made highly processed foods the least expensive? Great question.
Yeah, wow, that is a great question. Yeah, so flour processing, what a great example of how the changes in the way we produce food has affected our health and affected consumption. As I understand it, the reason all those nutrients were taken out of the flour was so that it would last longer, because otherwise it goes rancid pretty quickly when the fats and I don't really understand all the nutrients of it, but when they're left in, the flour goes rancid more quickly. So if you take them out, the flour is more shelf stable. It can be stored longer. It can be transported farther. It can be sold in different places. And that production method, that highly refined flour, is what really had led to all the other changes in food processing, making it less healthy. How do we address that? Oh, wow. So there are a few local processors that are trying to process grains the old-fashioned way. I don't know of any for wheat in this area, but there are a couple grain mills in Mississippi that process cornmeal and grits, and you can support them, just by purchasing their products. Delta Grind and Grit Girl, I think, are the two that I know of in Mississippi. There's a way you can vote with your food dollar, for sure. How you spend your money can affect change in the food system by creating market demand, by saying this is what we want more of. We want whole grains. We don't want highly processed, Wonder Bread. But it's also a matter of policy. So engaging in advocacy work, paying attention to legislation like the Farm Bill that includes subsidies for highly processed foods, refined, high fructose corn syrup, corn production, soy production, voting, right? Writing your legislators, like making, this is exercising food power or agency over your food system to the degree possible. I mean, I know when many of us hear of these issues, we feel so overwhelmed and disempowered, but I don't want you to walk away with that. I want you to think about, there are things you can do individually, but also collectively and politically to advocate for change. And gosh, that's just such a great example of the way bread has changed. Thank you for that question.
Do you have any good websites or newsletters where people can sign up to stay informed about what's going on in the legislation, so you can actually stay up to date when they get ready to make changes, because sometimes we get overwhelmed with what's on the news, or it has come and gone before we realize it, where we don't have a chance to use our voices.
Yes, yes, there are advocacy organizations, any groups advocating sustainable farming. There's a national sustainable farming coalition. Nathan, you might know of some too that deal with policy advocacy. It's been a few years since they've renewed the farm bill, so it should be coming up again in, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. I can Google it, or you can look that up and see. Yeah, there are definitely Civil Eats. Absolutely, Civil Eats is kind of an aggregation of news sources and focused on food justice and advocacy. So yeah, great suggestion, Nathan. Thank you.
Great. All right, we've got some more questions coming in. Here's one from asking, how can we fight to eliminate the food tax in Tennessee? He says, I cried when I saw an old age woman with a cane who could barely carry the milk that she was buying and had to pay the tax on it.
Man, yeah. Again, we all have to vote. We all have to hold our legislators accountable. We have to, those of us who have privilege have to be willing to give up some of that privilege. Our tax system in Tennessee is very regressive. It taxes the poor through things like food tax and high sales tax, but there's no state income tax, for example. So if you want a different tax system, if you're from a privileged background, you're going to have to be willing to pay more in taxes, right? And we have to be willing to pay more for food too. I mean, not the poor. Food should be. We should have a robust food stamp SNAP benefit system. Tennessee was trying to make work requirements part of receiving food stamps for a while. I think they did drop that, but quality food is going to cost more, and people who can pay more, I think, need to be willing to pay more. And when it comes to taxes as well. And yeah, I mean, that's a great issue to organize around, I think, for congregations, because it is a justice issue.
That's a good point. Here's some good points that were made. It looks like someone has posted it. It appears that, one of the problems is really compounded because these food desert areas are where large numbers of the homeless population are located, and they certainly don't have the transportation. That is a good point. And in one of the perfect areas, I guess, is what you were talking about, in a perfect world, would be great if everybody had the land that they needed to be able to grow their own enough sustainability. That would be great, because they would have their own food. But we don't have that. We have so many people living in housing, authority buildings without yards and things like that. So what do you think what's your perfect vision for, Memphis? What do you think that would look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question and a good point. I think, and I saw another question about what church communities can do. And there are attempts. So Memphis has a lot of vacant land, actually, a whole lot of vacant land, blighted properties, but just empty lots as well. In Washington Bottoms, there was a community garden that was organized by the Hope Homelessness Collective out of the Mid-South Peace and Justice Center. And it was a beautiful and thriving garden for 2 or 3 years. And then the land was ironically bought by Kroger to put up a grocery store because it was close to Crosstown. And then they never did. So people lost use of the garden. They did not get a grocery store. But that aside, that model of working with people to grow their own food. Churches have land, right? Churches tend to have a lot of space that's usually just lawn or landscaping. So what are some creative ways to start church-supported agriculture, to have community gardens on site? I mean, that's a powerful organizing tool as well, to work with people in need in an empowering way. I mean, I think obviously we have to be careful about the way we do this, right? You don't have food, therefore you should be forced to grow your own food.
Right,
No,
right.
it's the way you approach it is in relationship and solidarity and partnership, and using some of the resources that churches have, like land, to think about that in more creative ways, to get into the production side of food, as well as the redistribution, which we tend to do a pretty good job of already, I think, through food pantries and soup kitchens and the like.
Right. I know I'm from come here from the Colorado area, and there's a lot of open space, and a lot of the corporations there that have open spaces. One of the hospitals was really great about giving land for use, and allowing people to come and have a space that they could garden on, and everybody was allotted the same amount of space, and you just worked your own garden area.
Yeah, and one other thing that I think churches can do is support local farmers, churches that provide meals, and try to buy locally as much as possible to shorten that chain, that food chain, so that you're dealing directly with local farmers. There's one other thing I was going to say in addition to the local farmers. It's gone. Maybe it'll come back in a minute.
Well, that's a great point. That's a great point for churches to be able to support the local farmers. Does anyone else have any questions?
No more questions. So I can read this. Martha Lyle is listening by phone, and she suggests that we pressure denominational leaders to weigh in on policy advocacy. If the UMC is an international institution, really applied pressure politically and on grocery chains and enlisted other denominations to do the same. Institutional pressure at local, state, regional, and national levels. Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, collective agency, working together with other institutions at the denominational level where you have more influence. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I know the other thing I was going to mention. So in addition to churches supporting local farmers and starting community gardens, church gardens on their land, gleaning programs are really effective and something that congregations have tended to be very supportive of. So picking up food that would be wasted at Costco or at grocery stores, or from the farmers market at the end of the period when there's something left over, having committed volunteers to go and pick up that food and don't either use it in a food pantry or share it. I mean, congregations can partner together. Not everybody has to do it all by themselves, right? So you build power by working together. I know the Collierville, I think it's the Collierville Methodist Church, United Methodist does this redistribution ministry and picks up at Costco and grocery stores, and then partners with other churches in Midtown who have robust feeding programs. So being able to work together like that, it's a really direct and impactful way to affect change in our food system and increase food security. Anything else? I'll put my email address here if anybody thinks of anything. I am happy to follow up later and answer questions as they come to you.
All right. That sounds great. Okay, well, if there is nothing else, We sure appreciate your time. And would love to thank you, Dr. Holmes, for being our presenter today. It was so interesting and so insightful. And we just want to thank you again for, all that you have done in the area. And if anybody would like to thank Dr. Holmes, just put a little note in the chat there. And again, I want to remind you that this series is funded by a grant from the United Methodist Earth Keepers and sponsored by the Green Seminary Initiative here at Memphis Theological Seminary. And thank you again for those that have attended. And we'd love for you to check out the ministry, Doctor of Ministry in Land, Food, and Faith formation here at MTS. Thank you so much. And that will be all for today.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.